Clegg from the Community Foundation of Middlesex County, and I host Feel Good Fridays every Friday morning at 9 a.m. And you're listening to ICRV Radio, the stream feeding the river valley. And I hope you love living in Middlesex County as much as we do.
Now in its second year and powered by the Friends of the Office of State Archaeology, this is Archaeology of Connecticut, and just at the top of the program, we're going to get to all of our experts and guests around our virtual roundtable, but I just want to apologize to everyone listening for a little bit of clunkiness as all of the broadcasts from ICRV Radio are being done with all the guidelines adhered to. So we are quarantined in the studio and we are connecting telephonically. But with that, we have the state archaeologist, Sarah Sportman.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to our first official quarantine episode of the Archaeology of Connecticut. I'm the Connecticut State Archaeologist, Sarah Sportman, and I'm joined tonight by my co-host, Scott Brady, the president of the Friends of the Office of State Archaeology.
Hi, everybody.
So, as Dave said, we're all calling in tonight because of COVID-19 social distancing guidelines. But we do have a great show planned for tonight. Given that it's finally spring, we thought it would be a good time to do a show on plants in archaeology. So tonight we're going to talk about the types of plant remains studied by archaeologists and the ways those materials preserve in the archaeological record. We're also going to discuss the ways archaeologists study preserved plant remains to learn about topics like diet, food preferences, farming practices, social relationships, trade, and the environment. Then we're going to finish up by discussing some recent plant-related research on significant archaeological sites in Connecticut. So tonight we're really pleased to be joined on the phone by two experts in the field of archaeobotany, that is the study of plant remains in archaeology. We have Dr. William Farley from Southern Connecticut State University. He's an assistant professor there. And we also have Krista Dozel, a PhD student in the Department of Anthropology at UConn. So it's a great round. It really rounds off the topic because Bill focuses mainly on the historic period and Krista on pre-contact Native American sites. So Bill, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your research?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me on, Sarah and Scott. It's really cool to be here, and thanks for calling me an expert on something. That's always exciting. So as Sarah sort of mentioned, I'm what's called a historical archaeologist. So mostly I work in the period after the arrival of European settlers to North America, and my work focuses on Connecticut. I work in Connecticut primarily. And I am sort of a generalist archaeologist. I do all kinds of different archaeology, but I have this methodological specialty in archaeobotany, particularly macrobotanical analysis, so particularly looking at seed and wood and identifying those and trying to use those to interpret about sites. So I'm mostly interested in the early colonial period, so that's like around the year 1600 to maybe 1675, right in there, and that being a really interesting pluralistic time period, looking at cultural change and continuity in that period, and how people sort of adopted all kinds of new ideas and things that came along with colonialism. But we'll talk about later, too. I also am interested a little bit in the prehistoric period, particularly in the emergence of agriculture, maize agriculture, in New England during the woodland period. And so we'll see, I think, later where that's a place where Krista and I have some overlap in our research. So thank you again for having me.
Great, thanks, Bill. Krista, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your work?
Yeah. So I'm working on a PhD at UConn, and whereas Bill looks at what we call macro remains, so that's like carbonized, burned seeds, so you can see them with the naked eye, basically. I look at microscopic plant remains. So, and like Bill said, one of my big research areas is looking at the introduction of maize agriculture into the region. So, of course, maize and squash and some other things were domesticated in Mesoamerica and then traveled up at some point into New England. And so I'm looking at when that happened and what that looks like and how kind of plant cooking and processing changes over time.
Okay,
and I do what's called, I guess, so as Bill was explaining, he does historical archaeology. I do pre-contact archaeology. So contact is the point at which the English first came in contact with the indigenous people, so we call it pre-contact because it's before that time. Right. So let's talk about plant remains themselves. On this show, on several different episodes, we've talked a lot about kind of the poor preservation in our region of organic materials because we have acidic soils and there are other kinds of factors as well. But let's talk about plant remains because I think that most people probably think of plants as kind of temporary and fragile. They're organic, they're seasonal. You might not necessarily think of them as surviving for a long time in the archaeological record like rocks or ceramics. So given the nature of plants, I'd like to kind of start out by talking about plant remains as archaeological materials. So can you each kind of address this in terms of the types of plant remains that you study? So, Bill, why don't you go ahead and start?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. So this is really fascinating, and it's probably the thing that archaeobotanists, maybe at least macrobotanists, think about more than anything. It's so important, it's so central, this question of preservation. So as Krista was saying, with macrobotanicals, like that, what that term really means is that this is things you can see with the naked eye, or usually using a simple stereo microscope as our sort of extent of our tools. I think you'll hear when Krista talks about that it's a very different process to look at microbotanicals, and that's pretty fascinating. So these materials, macrobotanicals, seeds, charred wood, they're very subject to preservational issues. Essentially, they're only preserved in exceptional circumstances. So your average just hole you dig in the ground is not going to usually be an exceptional circumstance. So that it usually means either it can be preserved through desiccation, being dried out, like in a desert or something. Waterlogging, meaning it's like underwater. Sometimes you'll get exceptional preservation. But most commonly, we're talking about things that get charred. So for seeds and wood, that's usually things getting burnt, say, a hearth or some feature like that. So as Sarah was sort of alluding to, New England has these really acidic soils and a kind of a modest climate, which means we don't often get things like desiccation and waterlogging here. So we're usually talking about charring when it comes to macrobotanical remains. So we usually only get seeds and wood from intact, closed features. So most macrobotanicals, it's going to be true, I think, with microbotanicals too, but generally most macrobotanicals come from quote-unquote sampling, I would call it, rather than just from screening artifacts. Sometimes you get lucky and you find some seeds in a screen, but most of the time you find like a hearth and you take out a big chunk of that hearth, maybe even the whole hearth, back to a lab. You float it, which is a technique maybe we could talk about later if we have time. It's really interesting too. And then you analyze that in a laboratory, and that's where we normally get macrobotanical remains from. So that means they're kind of accounted for very differently than normal artifacts. It changes the calculus on how we even think about these artifacts. We have to usually use things like statistics and modeling to integrate that data into our data set. So that's sort of the long and short of it on how we get macrobotanicals and how they are tied to preservational factors.
Okay, well, let's talk a little bit about that recovery process using floatation, because that's something that we do in archaeological sites widely, but it's not something that we've talked a lot about on this program. Can you talk about that process and how it works?
Well, it really is. It seems like a really fancy thing, and sometimes you use kind of fancy equipment to do it, but it really is exactly what it sounds like. You take soil out of the ground, out of the site, and maybe in like 2-liter samples or something, or like I said before, maybe even like taking out a big chunk of a feature. You take it back to the lab, and you can use either a kind of a fancy piece of equipment called a float tech, or you can do it just with like a bucket and some simple screening materials. But essentially you dump the soil into the water, you agitate the water, and botanical material is really light, and so it will float to the top of the solution, and you can essentially skim it off. And so it separates out the botanical material from the archaeological matrix, the soil and the rocks and stuff like that. And then usually archaeobotanists and other lab technicians will look through all of those different parts. We'll go through the rocks and stuff that get left behind. We'll look through the botanical material, and this has the added benefit of there's really no technique in archaeology that captures more material than flotation. You're running it through the finest sieve you possibly can, essentially, to separate it from soil. So sometimes we also have the added benefit of you'll find really tiny, cool non-botanical artifacts, tiny seed beads and pins or things like that you normally would miss in the field because they fall right through even an 1/8-inch screen, a very fine mesh screen. But what that floatable remnant, that part that floats and gets skimmed off, an archaeobotanist will go through that, and there'll be lots of modern material, but there'll also be charred material mixed in there. And so you have to go through all those steps really to capture that material. And so you have to think really hard about how that then gets integrated back into your data set, because it's being recovered in such a radically different way than, lithics or ceramics or something like that, which you normally find in the field.
Yeah. And I think that, to really kind of illustrate how fine the screen is that you're using for this, I mean, these things are being scooped out and kind of sieved using pantyhose, basically. It's one of the rare uses for knee-high pantyhose.
Yes, when I was in my master's program, I had to, during the field one day, I was helping teach a field school to undergraduates, and I had to go to the convenience store near where we were working to buy we ran out of pantyhose, and so I had to go in, and those like little knee-high pantyhose that come in little eggs. I went into the store and bought literally every one of those that they had. So I walked up to the register with like 35 of those eggs of pantyhose, and the person behind the counter gave me a really weird look.
Have you had to buy a lot of nail polish? Because that's another common archaeology purchase.
Yeah, I've not had to, no. But I think the lithicists in our crowd probably have to do that. The ceramicists probably have to do that, right? They got to go buy nail polish by the bucket load.
I think we have a new program in the works, Archaeology After Dark.
You have no idea how weird it is.
Oh, boy, this is mild. This is tame.
Okay. So, Krista, can you tell us a little bit about kind of the preservation and the recovery of the microbotanicals? Like maybe get into, what they are and how we find them, where we find them, how they're recovered, because it's very different, as Bill was saying, than the larger macrobotanical remains.
Oh, yeah, it's very different. And while I think a lot of the macrobotanical remains stuff is a little bit intuitive, this is going to have to be, you're going to have to, like, delve into your high school science classes a little bit. So hopefully you'll stay with me. But, yeah, so looking at microfossils, so plant micro-remains, it's really complementary to macro-remains. You look at micro-remains when you don't expect very good preservation. So the one thing about micro-remains is that they can preserve a very long time. So there are two types of micro-remains that you can look at. So you can look at phytoliths, which is what I usually look at. You can also look at starch grains. And I will explain the difference between those two, but I will say that scientists have found phytoliths in dinosaur coprolites. So that's how long they can last. So the preservation can be really excellent under the right circumstances. And if you have both macro remains and micro remains, when you look at both, you can really see like a bigger picture about things. So phytoliths, you can think about them a little bit like plant skeletons. Okay, so if you think about plants, they put down their roots, they take water and minerals from the soil. One of those minerals is silica. And in some plants, not all plants, but in many, a lot of plants will take in silica, and the silica will harden in and between the cells. And so what I'm looking at are actually like silicified plant cells. I am seeing like the imprints of plant cells in silica. So you can really think about it as like a plant skeleton. So starches are totally different, though. They're microscopic, but that's kind of like where the similarities end. So if you think about like a potato or a corn kernel or like a carrot or some kind of like tuber, so plants make those, like we eat them because they provide us energy, but plants make them because they provide the plant energy. And so starch grains make up like the tuber of the potato or other tuberous plants. So those, you can see them and you can identify them under a microscope. So those are really good if you want to look at domesticated plants or or even wild food plants. So it's really good to identify food sources. But phytoliths, you can look at some food sources, but you can also look at environmental things. A lot of grasses make phytoliths in particular for a lot of reasons I can get into, but if you want me to, but it's kind of boring. But grasses make a lot of phytoliths. And so luckily, a lot of the plants that people eat are grasses. So you think of corn, rice, wheat, barley, that sort of thing. Those are all grasses, and they all make a lot of phytoliths, and you can identify those under a microscope. Now, you asked a little bit about the extraction process. And so with macro remains, you're really just taking soil and you're sifting it through things, perhaps pantyhose, but it's a lot more high tech. It involves a lot of centrifuging and acids. Basically, if you're taking phytoliths from the soil, you have to go through a series of steps where you're taking out things from soil one at a time. So you're taking out calcium carbonates with acids. You are taking out clays. At one point, you're taking out. At one point, you use heavy liquids to separate sediment particles from phytolith particles. Yeah, it's kind of a higher tech system, and you need a lot of equipment to do it. Whereas if you're doing macro remains, you just need some stuff that you can buy, at the drugstore. But you need like a real lab if you're going to be extracting phytoliths or starch grains from the soil.
Yeah, microbotanists get to wear lab coats, which is
yes, and goggles. Oh yes,
yeah.
I feel very fancy.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was very nervous. So when you have to, some processes involve some stronger acids like nitric acid and potassium chlorate and things, and I was really nervous about this at first because you get geared up, you have to wear like this special protective apron and sleeves and goggles. I haven't lost any fingers yet. So,
what's the one that goes through
fine.
your skin and burns your bones away? What's that one? Is there one that does that?
I don't think that's the one I'm using.
No, I think that might be There's just
on the upside,
nothing that
on the upside, you must be pretty well geared up these days for grocery shopping. You've got all that equipment on hand.
Indeed. Yeah, I had a lot of gloves that I'm going to donate, actually. I have lots of latex gloves to donate.
All right, well, would you guys want to talk a little bit about some of the major research questions you're trying to address and how you do that through plant remains, kind of bring it back to some of the archaeological sites maybe that we've talked about in the past in Connecticut? Krista, since you're kind of on a roll, why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit about some of the research you're doing, right? Because you're working on your dissertation right now.
Yeah. So basically, what I've been focusing on for my dissertation is I'm looking at burned food residues, actually. So if you've ever had a big cooking accident and you burn food on the inside of your pot, well, ancient people also did that. They burn things onto their pots. And so that stuff is often still stuck to ceramic shards. And you can see it. And I don't know, every time, actually, because of COVID now, I have all of these ceramic shards like in my living room in boxes because I had to take them with me. But it still blows my mind that when I look at them that I'm looking at, burned food that somebody was eating at one point, or maybe I guess they weren't eating the burned part, but it's still there. Anyway, so I take a little dental pick and a clean dental pick and I scrape off this kind of charred residue from these ceramics. And then I treat this residue with a couple different acids, and then I mount it on a slide, and then I look at it, and so that's kind of the process. But what is interesting is it tells you exactly what's in the food that they're eating, and I focus on, and you could take phytoliths from food residues, but you could also take them from the soil. But I take them from food residues because that's what people tend to keep. So I haven't had to dig up any new material. I've just been able to go into collections and find sherds with residues and use them for my dissertation. And it's been a nice way to engage in less destructive archaeology because I haven't had to dig anything new up. But I've been looking at these to find. Oh yes, so I am looking at sites between the ages of 2,500 years ago and 500 years ago. So as I said earlier, I'm looking to see when and how people start incorporating domesticates into their subsistence structures. Okay, so I'm looking at like the earliest examples of maize and squash. I would look for bean, but I haven't found any bean yet. So I wanted to see when they start showing up, where they start showing up. So I'm looking at sites that are on the coast. I'm looking at sites at Black Island. I'm looking at sites kind of in the interior Connecticut River Valley. So like where do they start showing up and what does it look like in the residue? What kind of phytoliths are we seeing? And so that's been one of the big questions.
Krista,
what am I missing?
I know we've talked before on the difference between like the green corn versus the dried corn and how that's part of what you're looking at. Could you talk a little bit about that, maybe?
Yeah, absolutely. So here's where we have to get into the weeds a little bit about phytoliths. So what's cool about phytoliths is that you can see different parts of the plant make different phytoliths. Okay, so the cob, like a maize cob, will make distinctive phytoliths. A maize leaf will make distinctive phytoliths. The husk will make distinctive phytoliths. You can tell these apart. So I've been looking for cob phytoliths in the residues. So it's important to note that actually maize kernels, they don't make any phytoliths. They would make starches, but they won't make phytoliths because that's not where the silica is being hardened. So you can think about if they're cooking corn, you would expect to see phytoliths from the cob because that's the closest tissue. Like if you cut corn off of the cob, if you do this at your house, you can see that there's still cob tissue on there, right? And so that you're going to see cob phytoliths in your residues. Now, one of the interesting things that I found, one of the things that really surprised me when I first started going, is that some of the later sites didn't have any maize phytoliths in the residues. There's a site called Burnham Shepherd where they found just hundreds of maize kernels. Like they're eating maize. We know that it's there. And this is an example of when macro and micro remains can really show you interesting things. So we know that maize is there, but I wasn't finding it in the residues. So what does this mean? Well, I think what we're seeing is a difference in how they're eating corn. So if you take corn cobs and you dry them out and you separate the kernels from the cobs, that tissue is going to dry and just fall off of the kernels. And so later, if you cook them, you're not going to find any phytoliths in your residue because they're cooking them. They're processing the maize in such a way that it's not going to leave any phytoliths in the residue. However, if you are taking like a whole, corn cob, you throw it in your pot, you're going to get a lot more phytoliths. Or if you took a corn cob and you scraped it off while the cob is fresh or green, then you're going to get a lot more phytoliths in the residues. So when we eat corn, most of the time when we eat sweet corn, that's what we would call green corn, okay? And so that's when you're going to get a lot more phytoliths because that cob tissue is still attached. Now, if you let it dry out and you make it into cornmeal or something or hominy, you're going to find a lot less. And so I think that what we're seeing maize use change over time because in earlier sites, such as sites on Black Island, I actually did find samples with several diagnostic maize phytoliths in them. But at this other site where we know that they had maize, I found nothing. So that's some interesting things that I've been finding.
Right.
So, does that make sense?
Sorry, go ahead.
So it's possible that maybe what we're starting to see, and obviously, you still haven't concluded your research, is that as in that time period, corn is becoming more of a long-term food resource. They're preparing it and storing it and using it later in a much different way. Is that fair to say?
Yes, that's absolutely the idea. So I was going to get into this a little bit later, I think, but the idea is that they might be eating it right away. So in earlier time periods, they might grow some maize and then eat it right away, and so that they wouldn't be drying it out and storing it for later. So you'd be less likely to find maize macro remains because they're eating it all and they're not drying it and storing it like underground or above. But later, when they start storing it, right, then there's a change in how they're using it. And this all has a lot of implications for sedentism and lifeways and the development of like social inequalities and hierarchies. There's a lot of interesting things in there. For a long time, people thought that, if you're growing food, if you're engaging in agriculture, you have to be sedentary. And then once you're sedentary and growing food, as soon as you start doing that, then you start having people accumulate wealth, then you start seeing a lot of social inequalities, and all of these things go together. And actually, if you look at the ethnohistoric record, we're finding that there's a lot of evidence that groups grew maize but remained nomadic. They kind of, it was supplemental to their other, they were able to grow maize, but it was just kind of incorporated into their previous subsistence strategy. It didn't really change a lot of their life ways in huge ways until later.
So sort of people were hunting and gathering, kind of just gardening on the side, but it wasn't like the focus of their subsistence activity.
Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
So you're the Pandora's box of corn, then?
Yeah, kind of. Yeah, because we have found it, and it's been interesting because so far, and I'm not done looking at all of my samples yet, but I have found it at sites that are much earlier than we anticipated. So, and this is where the strength of phytoliths comes in. So the earliest, I think we haven't explained this yet, but the earliest time where you start finding maize kernels is about 1,000 years ago. But I have maize phytoliths from ceramic sherds from Block Island that date until perhaps 2,300 years ago, which is a huge gap. That's a 1,300-year gap right there. And this is not just. I'm sorry.
I just said that would push maize way back in the region for sure.
That would push maize way back in the region. But you're seeing this kind of all over the country where they start looking at phytoliths. There's this huge gap between when you see the first phytoliths and when you see the first macro remains. So then there's this big question in the community, which is, why are we seeing this big gap? But if they're eating it and using it in different ways, that might explain why we're not seeing it until later. Because if they're eating most of their crop right away, you have to think about how corn preserves, right? So it's going to preserve much more easily if you're drying it, you're storing it, you're cooking lots of it. But if you're, growing small crops and you eat it right away and you only save a little bit for next year's crop, you're just not going to find it. So that's what I think that we're seeing.
Okay, it's really interesting.
Yeah.
Hey, if it's okay with you guys, how about we take a little pause in the action and thanks some of our merchant partners for allowing us to do what we do. And we have more Archaeology of Connecticut coming up right after this.
If you're like me, you can't believe how quickly the new year is off and running. The groundhog and St. Patrick have come and gone. Next, taxes. We are in tax season. It's okay. Don't stress. I want to offer some calm by taking this opportunity to remind listeners it's not too late to make or recommit to resolutions for a financially healthier new year. Hi, I'm Tom Britt, one of the managing partners at Benchmark Wealth Management in Old Lyme. We want our communities to thrive, and we want our residents to make and hit their personal financial goals. That's why I want to share our 5 steps that can lead you to a better 2020. First, as you review your last year, think of things you've learned, the things that might have frustrated you, the things you might have done differently. Remember them. They are only mistakes if you repeat them. If you learn from them and apply lessons learned to a better approach for 2020, well, that's a fantastic first step. Next, before any grand goals are addressed, make sure debt is gone. Get rid of those high interest balances on your credit cards or any revolving debt that you might have. You do this so bigger and better things can be achieved. Third, have a plan, a savings plan for the future. If one is in place, then find ways to save more, either by cutting expenses or putting any raises or bonuses straight to savings. And when these savings go straight to your 401k or IRA, well, that's where the magic is happening. Next, invest with a purpose. Make sure your retirement plan is all about you, your goals, your circumstances, and make sure the plan is devised to weather market fluctuations. Remember, this is a marathon, not a sprint. Finally, whether it's us at Benchmark Wealth Management or somewhere else, please make sure you find a financial professional that cares about you on a personal level, knows what is important to you, knows your specific priorities and challenges, and commits to you with a plan that is specific to you. At Benchmark Wealth Management, our greatest investment is in you. If you are ready for a highly personalized approach to financial planning and investment management, we would love to meet you. Call us at 860-434-6890. Again, that is 860-434-6890. Or visit us at our website, benchmarkwealthmgmt.com. Your goals and dreams deserve personalized expert planning, support, and service. benchmarkwealthmgmt.com.
Securities offered through Private Client Services, member FINRA SIPC. Advisory services offered through Benchmark Wealth Management LLC, a registered investment advisor. Benchmark Wealth Management and Private Client Services are unaffiliated entities.
Now, welcome back, everybody, to Archaeology of Connecticut and our state archaeologist, Sarah Sportman.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back. We were talking a little bit with Krista about her research goals and what she was kind of working on her dissertation about using plant microfossils. I want to switch over and kind of talk to Bill about what kinds of things he's been looking at with macro remains here in Connecticut.
Yeah, so before I move into kind of my main research interest, I guess to sort of finish out that conversation about the adoption of maize agriculture, I had recently with a couple of colleagues, Gabe Reineck and Amy Fox, had a new paper come out where we were exploring this, not, maybe ironically, not really through an archaeobotanical lens, but actually looking mostly at architecture and house sizes and things like that. And we were looking at the same sort of moment of time that Krista was talking about, this 1,000 years ago-ish time period when plant macrofossils, let's say like, maize kernels, start showing up on sites in this part of the continent. We were seeing some really interesting relationships there, and that there did seem to be some evidence that things were changing around that time. Houses getting bigger and more elongated, and there's kind of deep research, as Krista was alluding to, about how the adoption of agriculture is often worldwide associated with things like a rising inequality and the founding of state governments and increases in population density, and in some places that really goes to an extreme where you get massive cities like, say, Mesopotamia or something like that, right? And that didn't really happen around here. We were sort of interested in that, and so I think that Krista's research, I'm super fascinated and excited to see what her findings are, because I think that really complicates what we found and adds a really interesting element that if 1,000 years ago we get maize, and we also get some changes to the rest of culture that we think maybe are associated with maize. But maize is actually kicking around 1,000 or more years before that, but it's being prepared in this different way. What does that say about the way that people are adopting agriculture in this region, how it's really different from a lot of other regions in the world? So there's a lot going on there that I'm really certainly interested in. But mostly, as I mentioned before, I'm primarily a historical archaeologist. I'm really interested in the study of colonialism and the ways that in the early 17th century and onward, in Connecticut, for instance, we suddenly have this really pluralistic place. You have many Native American groups. You have several different Euro-American nations or colonies settling, some English, some Dutch, and people certainly from other places in Europe as well. You have the first people from Africa coming into the region, both people enslaved and not. So you just suddenly have this kind of cosmopolitan, global sort of place, this Atlantic world playing out right here in Connecticut. And I'm interested in that time period and the ways that people reacted to that, adapted to that, and changed, or sometimes didn't change in that setting. And I think botanicals are a really fascinating avenue to look at this. Plants are in many, in all situations can tell us a lot, but I think they're really useful in this particular setting, usually in conjunction with other types of data. And so in this case, the most obvious is zooarchaeological remains. Our esteemed state archaeologist, Sportman, is in fact a zooarchaeologist. That's bones, right? So animal remains. So obviously, animal remains, plant remains. That's most of what diet is, right? That we're certainly interested in those together. But other things too. The ceramics from a site and the use of space at a site can tell us a lot about, or even lithics can tell us a lot about dining, or how people might have thought about where eating should occur. Food can be looked through a gendered lens, through an ethnic lens. Food can tell us a lot about identity and behavior in the colonial period. And food, you probably have some recipes, right, that are cultural to you. Everybody does, right? That you have some kind of food that you associate with your ancestors, with your ethnicity, with your with some connection to the past and to your cultural identity, right? Food is an important part of cultural identity. At the early colonial period, we have all these different people interacting for the first time. And for instance, some of those people are settlers or colonists who are very far from home, say the English, for instance. They suddenly have to reckon with the fact that they're trying to maintain a diet and a cuisine that's familiar, that's comfortable, that's what they want to eat. But they might, in many cases they did not, have access to the kinds of raw materials of food that they wanted. They might not have had, say, wheat or beef or pork or something like that in some particular setting, especially in the very early years of colonialism in New England. And we can see in the ethno-historic record, the historical record, English people writing about how frustrated they are that they can't get the food stuff that they want. What the archaeobotanical evidence for that period is showing us is that people are exchanging food in really interesting ways. We see Euro-American sites that have lots of indigenous domesticated plants like corn and squash and beans and things like that. And we can see in Native American sites, for instance, in some cases interesting evidence of Euro-American food stuff, especially animals more than plants, I think, from my sense. Actually, the animals start to make their way in a little bit faster. And so what does that tell us about, what are big sort of picture questions that we're trying to answer about how these people are interacting with each other, how their cultures are changing in light of each other, how they're being informed by one another, and also the darker sort of history. How does colonialism, imperialism, people being sort of crushed by colonial pressures, indigenous people particularly, and African people too, how do we see that play out at the dinner table, if you will? There's this whole kind of realm of archaeological theory called gastropolitics, which is looking at food and eating as a way of exploring political relationships within and without of the home. That's really fascinating, and the colonial period can be really powerful. So that's really broadly. I don't have actually as specific an answer for my research as Krista did, which is unfortunate because she's right in the midst of her dissertation. So, yeah, she's really.
She has to have a very specific answer to that question at this point.
Which is good.
Can I just jump in with a question? So, I mean, we're talking about like food and culture and diet and preference and all of these things, but how much of this is really just, this adoption of native foods, of local foods among European colonists is really just born out of necessity? We see some of the early accounts of the earliest settlers to Connecticut getting here in the fall. People always seek to arrive in the fall, which seems like the worst possible idea for an agricultural society. And then immediately, hit a harsh winter. Some of the earliest settlers of Connecticut had no access to provisions. They were like eating like ground nuts and acorns and having to trade for food from native people. So how much do you think that this inability, the need to survive really played into the adoption of these foods and the eventual integration of them into the cuisine?
I think it has a lot to do with it. Obviously, I think you're exactly right that it seems like from the early writings that English people don't really want to be eating these foods, and they're doing it because they have to. But then, interestingly, over time, those things become a part of the diet much more completely, and in periods when they are not starving to death. Right? Maybe not ground nuts and acorns, but maize, for instance. Right? I think we see, if you look 50 years after the arrival of Europeans, maize is an important part of European cuisine because it's just the food that you grow here. But even after people are able to start growing wheat or barley or something like that, I don't know if they ever include barley or not. Good question.
It seems like a lot of the. I was going to say, it seems like a lot of the ethnohistoric sources, like the writings of English people, like they write about maize and they're like, that's not so bad, I guess.
Yeah, they come around to it pretty quickly.
Yeah.
But I think, maybe even just the learning curve of learning to grow their traditional crops in a slightly different environment that's a little colder, a little bit harsher, different soils. It probably takes a few years for people to really get the hang of it and get things established. You got to eat something in the meantime, maybe.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think that's completely right. And they're learning a lot. English people are learning a lot from their native neighbors. And obviously we know that from many stories. But that's true. If they did not listen to their indigenous neighbors about how to grow this food and didn't trade for them with it directly or were even gifted it sometimes, I think I think they would have all starved to death. So there is a tremendous adoption of that just based on the necessity. But then over time it becomes a part of that cuisine, a new cuisine, a kind of something that's totally novel, some new cuisine that is American as opposed to European, I guess. And Native people have the same experience, right, where they're adopting new things from Europeans and they're creating something that is new and yet still indigenous. So that whole process is just really fascinating to me, and that's what I'm interested in. What gets me up in the morning.
So I think we've covered the foodways, but I think that there's a lot more, from what I understand, that these botanical remains can tell us about environment and climate and those kinds of things. Could you guys maybe talk a little bit about that? Maybe Bill, you could take the lead on that.
Yeah, I could talk. I haven't talked at all about charcoal. Really, the most common botanical that's found on archaeological sites is wood charcoal. It's also the least sexy, right? So it's just it's, I don't know, you collect it en masse. It's all over the place. And I actually think there's some really interesting things you can learn from wood charcoal. What is wood charcoal when you find it on site? It's either fuel wood or it might be construction wood from a house or from some structure. And that all is the question of what kind of wood are you using to build your house or to feed your hearth. Those are really interesting social and economic questions to ask. And so from wood charcoal, we can kind of ask economic questions. We can look at environmental questions, and I think maybe Krista might speak more about paleontology and pollen analysis. I know it's not exactly your jam, but that is technically microbotanical, which is a really powerful tool for looking at past environments. But wood charcoal could tell us a lot about environments too. So, for instance, I did my master's thesis was about wood charcoal in the 19th century, in the 1800s. And that was a period I was looking at samples from a reservation site, a Native American reservation site, and samples from a Euro-American site that were they're close to each other, just maybe 10 miles apart, not even 10 miles apart. But they're very similar sites. So one was on the reservation, one was not. And we can see really a lot by looking at the charcoal about what was happening in the microenvironment. So we know macro-environmentally that in the mid-19th century, Connecticut had essentially reached like the nadir of its forest coverage. There was down to, there was like maybe 10% forest coverage by, say, the 1860s in Connecticut. For reference, we now have something like 70% forest coverage now, and in the early 1600s, there was probably as much as 90% forest coverage in Connecticut. The landscape is really deforested, and you can imagine the woods that are missing are the ones that are the most valuable, ones that are really good fuel woods, ones that are really good construction woods. And I looked at these sites, one on the reservation and one not, and the reservation site had much higher proportions of higher quality woods, both in the fuel woods and the construction woods, than the Euro-American sites. We could, what I surmised from that was that the reservation was like a little preserved microenvironment where where they were being a little bit more careful about how they were culling their wood, and the population density was quite low, and so it was a little better forested than the surrounding region. And I had clues to this already in the historic record because the tribe at that time, this was the National Technical Club, the reservation I was looking at, the tribe at the time was complaining to the state legislature that English people, or at that not English but Euro-American people, were coming onto the reservation and stealing field wood, literally cutting down trees and stealing it from the reservation, which suggests there was some pretty desperate times off the reservation. And so you could see that in the historic record, and it turned out that the macrobotanical remains spoke to that. So that's a little bit about economics, a little bit about environmental reconstruction, all from looking at this kind of ubiquitous artifact class on sites, which is wood charcoal. Essentially, you can look at the wood charcoal under a microscope. It actually takes higher powered microscopes to do wood charcoal analysis than seeds. But if you can look at these microscopic structures within the charred pieces of wood, and you can identify them to family, to genus, sometimes even to species, and learn a lot about the types of wood that people were using on their sites for a variety of different purposes. And that can tell us a whole lot.
Very cool. Can I just jump in a little bit? So we've talked many times on this program about the Brian D. Jones site, the Paleoindian site in Avon, which is the oldest site in Connecticut at radiocarbon dated 12,500 years ago. And Katie Reinhardt, another archaeobotanist who works in CT in Connecticut, who couldn't be with us tonight because she's at grad school and she actually had an online class that conflicted with this time. She was doing some of the botanical analysis from that site, and there's some really interesting results in terms of the plant remains there, both in terms of diet and environment. Because I think, there's still kind of this bias thinking about the Paleoindian period as this kind of, very sparse tundra environment where there's not a lot of plant foods, and Paleoindians are focusing on game animals for their food. But there's actually, because of the fantastic preservation there's this really interesting array of plant remains that preserved in a couple of the features at this site, and they really give us a little bit more information about this time period, both in terms of the environment and the food. So she's got wetland species like cattail and water lily, which is really interesting because the local environmental reconstruction from the geology and other factors kind of suggest that it's adjacent to a developing wetland, so those plants would have been available. And cattail has like starchy tubers that you can eat. But there's also fruit. Seeds from fruits preserved at this site. There's strawberry, pin cherry, and also sumac. Kind of suggesting possibly a seasonality of like a summer occupation, but also that this environment actually has much more robust plant resources than maybe people generally think about. So I just thought that was really cool, and I wanted to jump in with that.
Yeah, and that site is exciting in so many ways. You know, its age, it's the kind of features that you all found there. It's pretty amazing. But just the fact that you actually have macromechanical preservation is exceptionally rare. You get macromechanical preservation at a site 12,000+ years old. It's just so rare. So that is a rare opportunity to learn about those things in the Paleoindian period. And frankly, I think some of those stereotypes about the Paleoindian period, you know, that they didn't eat plants, and that they were all big game hunters, and they didn't have a varied diet, probably actually comes from a dearth of archaeomechanical evidence from those sites because it just hasn't preserved. So it's a rare opportunity to really speak.
And that probably comes from a lack of preservation of cultural features like hearths and things like that, which they actually did have at the Avon site. And the fact that Connecticut is, you know, a lot farther south than some of the more well-documented Paleoindian sites. So the climate here probably was slightly more temperate than it would have been in some of the sites farther north. So we're kind of closing in towards the end of the show here, but can I just ask one question? So we've talked a lot about, you know, using plants to study food remains, to study environment, and things like that. Can we just kind of address, I mean, we know plants are everywhere, right? And a lot of the plants that existed in the past still exist today. So how do we know for sure that the plants remains you're looking at actually date to the site and aren't just naturally occurring in that location, aren't like modern? Can you kind of just clarify that? I mean, we covered a little bit of it with like residues and things like that, but just to kind of clarify like how we know what we know about these plants.
Boy, I guess, yeah. Well, I'll start with just a couple words and then maybe hand off to Krista. But the answer is that it can be hard to tell with macromechanical sometimes. You know, how do we know that these aren't just blow in? How do we know that they actually are being eaten? How do we know that they didn't get dumped into the site by some later natural event? The same way that we try and answer those questions with any archaeological remains, you know, looking at taphonomic processes, site formation processes is really important for that. And also, archaeobotanists tend to be distrustful, I would say, of data. They're some of the most extraordinarily careful archaeologists I think I've ever seen. I think all archaeologists are super careful, but you so have to be with archaeobotany because the preservational issues are such a big factor, and because of these sorts of questions about blowing and how those things get there. So we tend to trust in macromechanicals. We tend to only really trust seeds that come from closed features, like really like tightly controlled features, which is why we do things like float features, and we know we'll do random sampling from the rest of the site, really can contrast and make sure that the statistically speaking, the seeds that are showing up in the feature are different from those that are coming from just the general background noise. But also, like Krista was talking before about so much about looking at storage and these questions. You know, if we want to try and recreate the season of occupation for a site, sometimes we can find seeds, but they might be from, you know, quote unquote, the wrong season because people are storing them or drying them, right? So something that Krista was really getting into. Those questions can be really hard to answer with macromechanicals. So, I mean, the answer to the question is we have to be really vigilant and really careful and try not to present data that isn't really backed up by strong taphonomic arguments for why we think it's real. That's the way we kind of handle it in macrobot.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same with phytoliths if you're going to look at. So often with phytoliths, in particular, you're looking at kind of broad environmental chains, so I think it's a little bit less fraught because you're looking at big picture stuff, typically, but you still need, like, very good stratigraphic control and good understanding of the site formation process, absolutely. And, like, when I'm in the lab, I do things like I take compressed air and I blow off all the sherds with the residue to make sure that there's nothing just, like, sticking to it from the outside. But, yeah, that's an ongoing issue, and you just have to be really aware of how things might have gotten there. Luckily with me, when I'm mostly concentrating on domesticated plants, and I know that, you know, they're not wild. It's like they're not growing wild out in the Connecticut or Rhode Island forest. So if I find them, I feel pretty good about it, and, you know, if I were doing a lot with starches, I would be panicked all of the time because cornstarch is in literally everything, and it could be a disaster. But phytoliths don't blow around or stick to things quite as much, and most of the corn we eat is dried, processed stuff. So I think the risk of contamination is a lot lower for corn phytoliths.
Hey,
is there anything?
I want to take a chance.
Go ahead.
I just want to let our panel know and our listeners know, in the spirit of a shameless crossover plug, but we do a program every week with the executive director at the Noah Webster House. And it's our way of tipping the cap to the founding father that said, hey, you guys can write documents. I'm going to write a book. And felt that we needed to evolve by having one way we could evolve is having a common means through which we could communicate. But in last week's episode of Noah Webster's Words, it was all about words in our lexicon, our collective lexicon that we got from First Nation, from Native Americans. And they all have to do, well, a lot of them have to do with animals and plants. And I thought it kind of ties into a little bit about what you guys are talking about. And I thought our listeners might appreciate going on that related journey by checking out in our Anytime Listening archive, Noah Webster's Words. Sorry, Sarah. Sorry to interrupt.
Oh, no, that's fine. I was just going to say that, we're nearing in towards the end of the program, but does anybody have any just final thoughts that they want to add or anything that we missed that you wanted to cover?
One thing I didn't get to talk about was I mentioned that there was a late site where we had maize macro remains but no maize phytoliths. One of the things that I've recently found is that I've looked at other late sites that are about contemporaneous, and we're finding that they're doing things differently at different sites. So there are different ways that they're using maize. So at one site in Rhode Island, I found that there are all these, looks like maize leaf phytoliths in the residue that I haven't seen anywhere else. Like maybe they're cooking tamales or something. They're cooking something in corn leaves. That might be something that I'm seeing. So I just wanted to say that I'm finding some other interesting things.
That's really fascinating. I'm excited to read your dissertation. It sounds like you're really getting into not just diet, but also food waste, how food is being prepared, and how it's integrated into people's lives. It's a lot more interesting than just they eat corn, I think.
Yes.
Yeah, as archaeologists, we always want to try and get that layer deeper than just here's what they ate. That's we want to know that, but we always want to try and get into those deeper questions about what the food really sort of meant, or how it was unique to a particular area, things like that. So foods and plants can give a great lens into those questions.
Hey, before we sign out, Sarah, how can people find, follow, and be a part of all things state archaeology?
You can check out our website, which is osa.uconn.edu, and our Facebook page, and also the Facebook page for the Facebook page and website for the Friends of the Office of State Archaeology, which has lots of information. Currently, we're not doing a lot with the public, given the pandemic situation, but we're hoping that when this is over, we can jump right back in and get involved again. So.
Hey, I want to thank everybody for joining us telephonically. Fascinating conversation. And if you've missed any part of it, you can catch it in the Anytime Listening archive on icrvradio.com. And tune in next month for another edition of Archaeology of Connecticut. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.